Whoops. Hello, everyone. All right, it's Dr. Hall and Oliver, and we're going to do lecture 21, where we're going to talk about sleep and EEGs. He has impeccable timing. So we're going to divide this lecture into three parts. So the first part is what is sleep and why do we need it? Second is talking about the EEG and brain waves, and then we're going to talk about the stages of sleep and our sleep cycle. So getting started with sleep, what is it and why do we think we do it, or what have been the historical hypotheses for why sleep is necessary? So sleep can be defined as a period of suppressed consciousness that is reversible. So this would be as opposed to a coma where you can't wake somebody up. This is a period of time where you are unconscious or barely conscious, but you can be awakened. During sleep, you are much less, the word should not be responsible. You are much less responsive to external stimuli, right? So things aren't going to wake you up. You're not going to respond to things that are happening in your environment. And we also know that physiologically, your body tends to be less active. There's decreased muscular activity, your heart rate, your blood pressure, your respiratory rate, your overall metabolism, often your body temperature during certain stages of sleep. All of these things kind of go down a notch. So these are the things that are happening while we are asleep. How does that happen? So what is happening in the brain to produce these effects? Well, we know for one thing that the pineal gland, which we learned about a long time ago, located in the epithalamus, right? So back here, just outside of the thalamus, because here's your thalamus right there, that big central area. So remember, the pineal gland secretes melatonin in the evening, and that makes us drowsy and helps facilitate sleep. It's also part of what seems to lower our heart rate and our body temperature. So there's that. We also know that the reticular formation, which you learned about when we did the olfactory unit, and it's not shown in this diagram. So the reticular formation is kind of a series of cells that are located in the brainstem here, and they're really important for our overall alertness. So we'll come back to that when we talk about PTSD. So the reticular formation, you might also remember that's one of the areas that gets input from the olfactory system that doesn't have to go through the thalamus. So the reticular formation is suppressing activity. It's suppressing sensory signals that are coming up from the spinal cord to be able to get up into the brain. Now you might be thinking, no, wait a minute, I thought the thalamus was the triage center and decided what types of sensory impulses and sensory information comes to our conscious awareness, and that is true. The thalamus is like a smart triage system. The thalamus can look at a piece of information and kind of decide, is this relevant to what's going on in our life right now, or is this irrelevant? And it'll filter it out based on all that information. Reticular formation, much more blunt instrument. It's just like, nope, nobody's coming in right now, or oh, we're only letting the really big things come in right now. So it's not as detailed, it's not as specific, it's just kind of a general blockade almost, right? Obviously not complete, because things can still wake us up and come into our awareness. So the reticular formation is suppressing sensory signals from being able to get up into the brain. And then the pons, which this diagram is kind of strange because they have your hippocampus in here. So I'm going to outline the hippocampus so you can see it. And it's kind of out toward us. So there's the hippocampus. I don't know why they drew that in there. So it makes it hard to kind of see the pons, right? And the pons is this whole part of the brainstem here that's just across from the cerebellum. So you might remember that the pons is a really important relay tract for our motor system. So between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. So what happens when we're asleep is that the pons is actually suppressing motor activity. And in fact, during some stages of sleep, we are paralyzed and we cannot move. If you've ever regained consciousness during that part of sleep, it's a really scary situation because you're like, oh my gosh, I can't move. And then the other thing that we know that is happening in our brain biologically when we are asleep is that there are changes in what types of neurotransmitters are being released. Now, neurotransmitters are, of course, molecules released from the axon terminals into the synapse, which are then going to do either excitatory or inhibitory postsynaptic potentials on the receiving cell on its postsynaptic membrane. Different neurotransmitters sometimes tend to be more likely to do EPSPs or IPSPs. But it's not hard and fast. The same neurotransmitter can act as an excitatory neurotransmitter at one synapse and an inhibitory one at a different one. So this idea that some are excitatory and some are inhibitory is a gross oversimplification. However, we do find that there is decreased release of neurotransmitters that are typically excitatory, such as serotonin, dopamine, and acetylcholine when we're asleep. And we see an increase in GABA, which is gamma aminobutyric acid, so we just call it GABA, which is mostly inhibitory almost all the time, that particular neurotransmitter. So we've got all of these different things happening biologically in our brain tissue. Why do we sleep, right? All animals sleep. Some animals sleep a lot, like Oliver over there. He sleeps probably, I don't know, what is it for cats? I think it's like 18 hours a day. But almost all animals sleep. And so there's been lots of theories throughout the ages as to why we sleep. I mean, we could be getting so much done if we didn't have to sleep every night. So one theory is the recuperation therapy, that we just need to rest. Okay, we just need to take a break. And definitely repair systems do activate when we are asleep. So a lot of repair does happen during those stages. So that lends credence to this idea. And there is a decrease in overall body usage. Remember, I talked about how heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate go down, body temperature goes down. So our total energy consumption goes down by about 10%, which is not nothing, but it's also not huge. But then the other thing is that the brain is actually still very active during certain stages of sleep. So it's not just a rest and recuperate time in our lives. So some parts of that theory seem to hold true, and some of them don't necessarily apply. Then you'll read in the textbook about this evolutionary adaptation theory, that because we are so reliant on our visual sense that it's dangerous to be up and about when it's dark out. We might accidentally walk into a tree or walk off a cliff, or that we're going to be less able to escape predators. So we should just be quiet and inactive at night so that perhaps we are less vulnerable to them. But then that's kind of weird, because if you're still and not moving and not responsive to external stimuli, you're not going to hear a predator sneaking up on you. So that makes you more vulnerable to a predator if you're immobile and not as tuned into the world around you. So that one doesn't really hold up all that well. But who knows? Then there's this brain plasticity theory. And we know that definitely there are important brain functions that happen when we're asleep: strengthening of synapses, that long-term potentiation we learned about. So we know that a lot of memory consolidation happens while we are asleep. So it appears that important brain functions that are necessary for our optimal performance are happening during sleep. Okay, so this is the what and why. It is a reversible suppressed consciousness with some decrease in overall body activity. We've got the pineal gland secreting melatonin. We have the reticular formation suppressing sensory information. It's kind of like a do not disturb sign on the door. It doesn't matter who's knocking. Unless it's a really loud knock, we're not going to let them in. The pons is decreasing our muscle activity, and we see more GABA neurotransmitter being released, which tends to be inhibitory. So why do we sleep? Well, it seems to be important, at least in some ways, for rest and recuperation and repair. But the brain is still very active in some stages, and we think that is important for memory consolidation and other types of things, kind of pruning synapses, optimizing things so that we're ready for the next day. All right, that's it for 21A.